I'd like to welcome on the stage for our sponsor perspective, Patrice Willoughby, Vice President of Policy and Legislative Affairs Strategy for the NAACP, and Gigi Dixon, Executive Vice President and Head of External Engagement for Diverse Segments, Representation, and Inclusion at Wells Fargo for the sponsor perspective presented by Wells Fargo. Welcome.
Well, good morning, everybody. I'm honored to be here. I'm Gigi Dixon, Head of External Engagement for Wells Fargo, and honored to be here on behalf of my company to have this critical conversation. Housing, equity, and affordability, which is a major pillar of our Wells Fargo work to address the financial wealth gap. And this year we focused on a range of opportunities around housing affordability. We've announced a special purpose credit program initially focused on helping Black homeowners whose mortgages are currently serviced by Wells Fargo to refinance with below current market rates. The program kicked off in June, and with the Federal Housing Authority, we've serviced by Wells Fargo, expanded to Veterans Affairs loans with plans to include government-sponsored enterprise loans in the fourth quarter. We have a Dream Plan Home affordable mortgage program also, and it's helped more than 10,000 families purchase homes and assist with closing costs since its inception in 2020. So today I'm really proud to be here with you, Patrice Willoughby, with over 20 years of service to the U.S. House of Representatives executive branch and in the private sector. Patrice has applied racial equity to advancing financial services, tax, and technology. Patrice has served as Chief of Staff and Counsel to the late Congresswoman Stephanie Tubbs Jones in Ohio, District 11. You've guided legislation to enhance retirement security and expand SBA lending programs, and you've later served as Executive Director of the Congressional Black Caucus supporting the passage of the Recovery Act, Dodd-Frank Financial Reform, and the Affordable Care Act. And today, Patrice, you are the Vice President of Policy and Legislative Affairs Strategy for the NAACP. Welcome, Patrice.
Thank you.
So NAACP has had a long and proud history of addressing racial inequities and injustice and opening opportunities for people of color. Just this past July, we, Wells Fargo, participated in a housing panel with you, Patrice, and opening opportunities for Blacks in housing and home ownership. This was the 113th convention of the NAACP, an organization that is 113 years old. And we noticed that housing affordability challenges and lack of home ownership does create a broader economic impact. But Wells Fargo, along with the NAACP and other national partners, agree with the need for economic justice, housing affordability, and home ownership. So let's get into the conversation. So Patrice, what do you see as the biggest inequities in housing, and what is the linkage between racial inequities and home ownership and broader economic standing in the community?
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you, Gigi, and the Hill for inviting me here on behalf of the NAACP. It's really a pleasure to be here to talk about an issue which is so important and critical in the racial wealth gap. Home ownership is the #1 predictor of family wealth, and census data indicate that homeowners are have 89 times more wealth than renters. So if you look at the historic development of the housing market, we know that there have been restrictive covenants and federal programs as well that restricted the ability of African Americans to access home ownership. And currently, Black homeowners and Black renters are more highly burdened with debt than other communities. The rate of Black homeownership is around 44%, whereas for white homeowners it's about 74%. And so we have to look at the housing system holistically. This is one of the reasons why the NAACP has been a very strong proponent of student debt cancellation, because when the debt to income ratio of an applicant for a mortgage is too high, they cannot qualify. And so all of those factors impact the ability of people to access financing, because unless we address, we actually have to learn how to walk and chew gum at the same time. We have to address affordability, access, as well as break down any other structural barriers.
Yeah. So the NAACP, Patrice, has been a leader in fighting against racial inequities in housing, from working decades ago to remove the FHA exclusion for African American home buyers, to continuing to be a voice for fair housing today. 50 years after the passage of the Fair Housing Act, we still see discriminatory practices impacting home and housing opportunities. How can we make progress? And how does the NAACP view its role?
Well, first of all, the Fair Housing Act is such an important piece of legislation, but courts recognize that there is a liability attached to disparate impact in housing policy. And so at the NAACP, we have focused on a number of advocacy strategies, both activism, legislation, and engaging with corporate partners. We have had lots of discussions between the NAACP and Wells Fargo, some of them tough discussions, because we believe that it's important to attack the system on all sides. We have the ability to drill down on data, and it's important to have a racial equity lens on how policies that may appear neutral on their face have a negative impact on communities of color. And we have focused continuously in that area, as well as from the perspective of the federal level. We're aware that other factors may affect discrimination as well, and the ability and access of people to have their homes through, for example, the algorithmic models that value homes, that can create disparity in the property values on which mortgage lenders determine what the interest rate is and will be of the borrower. And so some of those are affirmatively and open policies. Others are hidden, not so much because anyone's hiding them, but because they're unintended, and they're unintended consequences that have to be examined for their impact on communities of color and other communities.
Yes, there's a nice focus, I think, that's happening right now around appraisal bias as you talk about the housing appraisals and housing values. And so it's a very, very important point, the hidden and the overt. Mm-hmm. So with the COVID pandemic, we witnessed an increase in public awareness and concern for the importance of a home to keep people together, healthy, and to reduce the transmission of the virus. Wells Fargo shared this concern, and since the start of the pandemic, we've provided $50 million to legal assistance and housing counseling organizations to help keep nearly 400 people housed. And we've also provided $10 million to the National Center on State Courts to work with justice systems around the country, reducing the impact of evictions that were talked about earlier today, and to make improvements to their processes. So as one of the economic policy leaders in the NAACP, Patrice, what is your suggestion for how public-private partnerships can expedite results for economic equity?
Well, I think, as I said, walking and chewing gum at the same time, very important. If you look at the 2020 HMDA data, for example, there are about 370 100,000 individuals or transactions that failed to complete because of the need for some type of assistance, either closing costs or down payment assistance. And that's one of a good example of how public-private partnerships can operate to really help individuals who would otherwise qualify or be able to obtain financing for a home. There are other aspects of public-private partnerships, for example, development requirements in some localities in which there are a percentage of units or homes that are set aside for moderate income families, and also intentionality in the way that those partnerships create the incentive for developers to do redevelop property in areas that are near schools and transit, properties that can be developed that have multiple units for families with children, and also that enable people who are moderate income to live closer to city centers as opposed to way out in the suburbs. So localities and government create the incentives, but the private sector has a really important role in providing the pathway for capital to flow to those programs that would enhance home ownership.
Very good. And so a housing affordability. Just last week, I had the opportunity to visit Milwaukee, Wisconsin. It's a good visit. Coming from Charlotte, North Carolina, the weather was really cool, and it felt really good. But what was amazing was Mayor Johnson and County Executive Crowley in Milwaukee launched our Worth Initiative in the market. Wealth Opportunities Restored through Home Ownership. That's what the acronym stands for, which is a program, Patrice, that you're very well aware of. We are providing $60 million in grants to support local collaboratives, and that is all of the different entities in the community coming together in 8 markets to address racial and ethnic home ownership gap. So it was really exciting in Milwaukee because our goal there, of course, is to stop the loss of home ownership. They're losing over 1,000 homes, or 1,000 individuals and families are losing homes a year. And the idea is to flip that to ensure that at least 1,000 homeowners are created per year over the next 4 years, 5,000 homeowners in total over that period of time. And so it's a realization that there's no one strategy to solve this kind of challenge in local markets, and it's been with us for a long time. And so what we'd like to know is, what are some of the strategies the NAACP thinks are important and most impactful when looking to open up more home ownership opportunities for people of color?
Well, as we mentioned public-private partnerships in the last question, I think we also have to look at some of the systems that people engage in when they're trying to obtain housing finance. For example, the use of credit. I have had many conversations within the NAACP and our committees that are throughout the United States, our units and state branches and chapters. And credit and debt are really critical aspects of home ownership. Alternate credit scoring would go a long way because currently when payments like utilities and other consistent payments that renters make are not included in a credit score, it has a depressive effect on the ability of individuals to access the credit markets. I also think that there is a huge role in financial education. When we speak with our units and branches, there's a huge hunger for the type of information on economic education, as well as home ownership programs that are offered at the state and local level. And with respect to supply, currently we know that there's been a supply gap of about 100,000 units for many, many years now. And supply, in terms of what municipalities can do, is really critical for individuals in their communities to advocate for the availability of legislation, or the enactment of legislation, I should say, that would reinforce the availability of lower income housing units. In recent years, the single-family residential market has been extremely attractive as a vehicle for private investment. Indeed, about 20% or 74% of the purchases by private equity were single-family homes, and about 20% of those were in the low to moderate income range. And I think that within communities, people are aware that they are priced out of the market because they're not able to access or compete with an investor that comes in and pays full cash price. And so the advocacy that we engage at the NAACP really connects people to the types of legislative ideas that municipalities can really work on, because this is a systemic issue. It's not just housing finance, it's affordability. It is the historic inequity of accumulated debt, and the racial, all of those contribute to the racial wealth gap, where people who are low to moderate income are really trying to access a market which increases year over year, but their finances, their personal finances, have not increased to keep up with it. So that's why I say it's going to take a whole approach, walking and chewing gum at the same time.
Absolutely, and all hands on deck. It was really amazing in the Milwaukee community to see all of those nonprofit entities come together and focus on every aspect of home ownership for those individuals and families that have not had access. They focused on rehab, they focused on empty lots, they focused on investor property, how to pull together a fund so that they could purchase those properties and to ensure that those properties were available to close the gap on the lack of inventory, housing inventory. And so all hands on deck, partnerships, very important, and we greatly appreciate the national partnership and the local community partnerships that we have with the NAACP. Thank you, Patrice.
Thank
for
you,
the
Gigi.
conversation.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.